everybody. So, cool junk to talk about. It is cool. It is cool because as far as stories go, it's really cool. So I usually have this little, see if it kicks on. Yeah, I usually have this little video in the background when I talk about it in class. It's really, we got a bunch of little video clips. Civil rights movement is mainly, I think I've mentioned it in previous units. When the television comes out and you can put the stuff on TV and show the rest of the country what's happening, it's really a game changer. All right. We're going to talk about Martin Luther King Jr., who is kind of the, he's the leader of the movement, I guess, psychologically. In history books, they talk about Martin Luther King Jr. He gives a lot of great examples. You shouldn't think of him as like the sole leader of this. There were thousands. I mean, just the amount of people that were involved in the civil rights movement is huge. He was a great teacher of showing other people how to do this and was as 100% involved as he could be on a daily basis once we get talking about him today. But he was by no means the only person that was leading the civil rights movement. But when you got to kind of handpick who the most important people are to talk about in the civil rights movement, when you're talking about a survey course of U.S. history, which is what this course is, then you end up talking quite a bit about Martin Luther King Jr. All right. Can't talk about civil rights movement. You don't talk about Plessy versus Ferguson. So, 1896, way back in the day, we talked about this early on in American 2. If you had me for American 1, we also talked about it then. Plessy versus Ferguson. Slavery ends and racism becomes rampant after slavery ends. Prior to that, it was like a class system. After slavery ends, racism becomes rampant, especially in the South. So a lot of the civil rights movement is going to be focused mainly in the South because that's where the highest concentration of African Americans are. African Americans, black people in the United States, make up about 13% of the American population. However, the vast majority of that 13% is in the South because that's where slavery took place. That is still true up to present day in 2020. All right. The highest percentage of black people in the United States are in the South. What's interesting to understand about that is, even though it's 13%, there are states in the South, even back in the 1950s, like I believe Mississippi is an example, where there are more black people than white people in certain states. There are states like Montana where people in Montana had never seen a black person, all right? And we'll explain why those clarifications are important to understand. 1865, Civil War ends, all slaves are freed. 1865 to 1896 is Reconstruction. All right, this is, and Reconstruction really ends 1877, but 1896 is a big year here for racism. Because Plessy versus Ferguson comes out in 1896, declares that separate but equal is okay. Hopefully you remember me talking about the story of Plessy versus Ferguson. Not going to go into it again here, but Plessy versus Ferguson says that it is legal to segregate people based on race. This is de jure segregation, all right? By doing this, what it allows is up until the 1950s. So we're looking at about 60 years here of you allowing to segregate black people and white people. And this was adamant in the South. All right. Black people couldn't live in white neighborhoods. Didn't matter if you have $1 billion. You couldn't live in white neighborhoods. White people couldn't go to black only convenience stores. White people couldn't go to black-only convenience stores, and black people couldn't go to white-only convenience stores. So you always see these black-only, white-only areas. And typically, whenever they show TVs, they show how black people can't go to the white-only areas. And then I just said that white people can't go to black-only areas, and you're like, why don't they ever show that? Well, there's a good reason for that. Black people weren't allowed the same jobs as white people were. They also weren't paid as much as white people. So the poorest part of town was going to be the black side of town where black people were required to live. Like you couldn't live anywhere else if you wanted to live in this town other than the black part of the town. This is where the term on the other side of the tracks comes from, because most towns were divided in half with train tracks, and white people lived on one side, black people lived on the other. They did not intermingle. And Plessy versus Ferguson made sure of that. The reason that you never really hear about white people being harassed for going into the black side of town is typically there is nothing in the black side of town you couldn't also get in the white side of town. But there are typically a lot of things in the white side of town you couldn't get if you're black in the black side of town. And so you wanted to go to the white only stores because there were things there that you couldn't get in the black only side of town. because of the systematic racism, which is de jure segregation, does not allow black people to be equal with white people. Even though the Supreme Court case is separate but equal. All it says is segregate them. What's interesting, and here's the another big thing that we're going to talk about. Schools. So taxes pay for schools. So they had black-only schools. Who pays for the black-only schools? The black people, from the taxes that black people pay. Black people aren't allowed the same jobs. They're not paid as much. Their amount of taxes they pay, since they are not paid as much as white people, are lower. Therefore, the black schools, by nature, are inherently unequal. And that's going to be the first big battleground here. All right? What you got to understand as well when we start talking about this and the introduction to the civil rights movement of people acknowledging that this is all wrong and we got to fix this. Black schools are built in the middle of the black-only section of town. Makes sense. That's where their kids are coming from. White schools are built in smack dab in the middle of the white-only section of town. All right? So you got to understand that going in here, but all of that gets organized after Plessy versus Ferguson. So this is after World War II. We're going to be here in the 1950s. I got a bunch of good little video clips here. A lot of them are a couple minutes long, but that's why instead of trying to race through this and do it in one day, I'm going to do the civil rights movement in 2 days so that we can hit everything the way we need to. This is just a picture of a white-only colored, this is colored here for colored water fountain. So the term colored was the appropriate term to use. Like, it was the most politically correct term to use at the time. We don't use it anymore because when everybody says the term colored, they think back to segregation because they're used to seeing all of this. It's like colored. Like it's like a it's like a triggering word now to think back of how awful segregation was. So once we are going to move away from segregation, we don't really use the term colored anymore in the United States. All right, Thurgood Marshall. So this dude is really important to know for a multitude of reasons. He kind of exists the entire civil rights movement and is a huge, awesome story. There's movies about him. So there's no good way to jump in here on Thurgood Marshall without constantly coming back to him, the entire story. So I'm just going to tell you the whole story here. So he kind of starts out at the beginning of the civil rights movement, and then right here in this slide, we're going to go all the way through his life and talk about how important he was. So there is an organization called the NAACP, still around today. It's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP's main goal at the time is to basically fight against de jure segregation. The segregation bylaw that says black people can't do the same thing as white people. All right, they are adamantly against that. So the NAACP has a lawyer. It's a black guy named Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall is a super, super awesome lawyer. He is so good at being a lawyer that whenever a case at the Supreme Court takes on one of the NAACP's cases, he's the one that goes in front of the Supreme Court and argues the NAACP's case. Which again, NAACP stands for National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So if you get a case to the Supreme Court, that's big time. That's rare. If you get to the Supreme Court and you win one, that's like a unicorn. Like that, like hardly ever happens. Shouldn't say unicorn because unicorns aren't real. Spoiler alert. But it is extremely rare for somebody to win a Supreme Court case in front of the Supreme Court. The NAACP sends 32 Supreme Court cases to the Supreme Court, all right, that are fought by Thurgood Marshall. And the reason it's so rare is the Supreme Court has to agree to hear the case. Just because you try to take it to the Supreme Court doesn't mean you ever get to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to listen to 32 NAACP cases. Thurgood Marshall is going to be in charge of all 32 of them. He's going to win 29 of them. All right. So Thurgood Marshall, absolutely amazing, awesome lawyer. I got a picture of him here. This is a picture of Thurgood Marshall. People are like, he looks white. It's a black and white picture. Anyway. So Thurgood Marshall, incredibly important here because he wins 29 of the 32 cases. While he is a fantastic lawyer, here's why he wins 29 of 32. He was right. He would go and be like, hey, Constitution says everybody's equal. This is not equal. And the Supreme Court's like, solid point. you win. So while he is a great lawyer, he's not like manipulating anything. He's just presenting facts, and the Supreme Court's like, hey, you're right. So Thurgood Marshall, and we're going to talk about the most important one that's going to come out in 1954. All right, it's called Brown versus Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall is going to be the lawyer at the Brown versus Board of Education, and it's going to be a huge turning point in American history. I mean, it is massive. So Brown versus Board of Education, being a huge turning point, is awesome. Thurgood Marshall, the reason that I don't want to move off of him real quick, because I want to go ahead and tell you the rest of his life story, because we're not going to have time to come back to him, because it gets wild and crazy. But so the civil rights movement is going to kick off in large part because of the court case we're getting ready to talk about, Brown versus Board of Education. He is the lawyer in charge of it. Now, he is extremely well respected by everybody in the NAACP. He is a absolute genius legal mind. He ends up being, so not only was he in charge of the whole civil rights movement, later on when he's older, and this is a picture of him when he's older, he ends up becoming the first black Supreme Court justice. So he spent his whole life in front of the Supreme Court and then ends up becoming the first black Supreme Court justice later on. And it's a really impressive story of Thurgood Marshall, him individually. But so this is Thurgood Marshall, fought for all these civil rights cases, won almost all of them, and then later in life was nominated and appointed to the Supreme Court as the first black Supreme Court justice. All right, Brown versus Board of Education, going back in time to 1954. So here's the situation. If you're black, you have to go to the black-only school in your town. If you're white, you have to go to the white-only school in your town. There is a girl. Oh man, I should look at all my notes. I've taught it so many times. I think I know this stuff, and then I start getting ready to say it. I'm like, oh, I hope I'm wrong. I believe she's in 3rd grade. Her name is Linda Brown. She lives, all right, in Topeka, Kansas. All right. So she lives in the white. She's black. She lives in the white-only section of town. She lives directly next to the white school. However, because she is black, all right, she has to walk like some crazy, like 2 or 3 miles just to get to the black side of town, to where a bus will pick her up in the morning, and then she has to ride like an hour and a half to school, and then has to do that coming back every day. Is it dangerous? It's just not cool. And the only reason that she has to do this, and she's in elementary school, I think she's 3rd grade. The only reason that she has to do this is because she's black. If she was white, she'd just go right next door to the school in the school district that she lives in. So in Kansas, which is not the deep South, this can happen where it's segregated in some and not others. So she was allowed to live on the white side of town, but she couldn't go to the white-only schools. Her father is going to sue the Topeka Board of Education, all right, and say, look, my daughter should go to the school she's right next to. It is dangerous for her to walk. The only reason that this is happening to her, and she is putting at this disadvantage to other kids who don't have to walk this far, is because she's black. If she was white, this wouldn't be a problem. All right. So they take this to the Supreme Court, and he's like, this is wrong. The Supreme Court, and man, this is huge. And there's a couple things about this that you need to understand that are so huge. So when Plessy versus Ferguson happened, it said segregation was okay. The court case ended up being like 6-3. 6 people saying, yeah, separate but equal is okay. The 3 were like, nah, that's wrong. Usually court cases are really close at the Supreme Court. Majority rules. There's 9 Supreme Court judges. Most cases are 6-3 or 5-4. All right. And then whoever's against it writes a dissenting opinion. Because you have Republicans, you have Democrats, you have, even though technically none of them are supposed to be in a political party, they all have leanings. Brown versus Board of Education is a absolute sledgehammer. All right. Because it is 9-0. Unanimous. These people, Supreme Court justices don't necessarily get along. All right. 9-0. That like never happens. Never has. 9-0. All 9 of them said, you're right. That's bullcrap. And let's take this a step further. Plessy versus Ferguson, that was bullcrap. The Supreme Court that existed 60 years ago really messed that one up. Don't know if they did it on purpose or not, but that's garbage. We're throwing it out. Now, you are not going to be required to go to school based on your skin color. You, now, in the United States, are going to go whatever school you're closest to. All right? You're going to go to the school which is district. So this is a huge win, all right, for Linda Brown and her dad and the Supreme Court. The fact it was 9-0 is going to just be like crazy, because it lets you know that the government, they're done with this de jure segregation thing, and times are a-changing, all right? You're going to see, because of this decision, the level of racism that most people in America had no idea existed, all right? Most people in America aren't crazy racist. However, sometimes in situations like Brown versus Board of Education, you're like, oh, I'm sure everybody will be fine with that. And then you just start seeing like come out of nowhere, just like crazy racist, like, no. And you're like, oh my gosh, like what is taking place? Brown versus Board of Education is one of those triggering moments for the racists in America that come out and say, absolutely not. Now, I also want to point out here, and I got a video clip to talk about this, that there is not, most things don't change, all right? Most places don't change at all, because all Brown versus Board of Education says is you go to the school you're closest to. Well, black schools are in the black part of town and white schools are in the white part of town. So white people go to white schools and black people go to black schools. There is a situation, and I want to go ahead and it's on the next slide here. Let me show you, because I'm almost positive that the video clip I'm getting ready to show you shows you the main issue in Brown versus Board of Education. But you know, let me talk about it and then go back to the video, because I should have looked at this first. All right. This is a picture in Arkansas, not Arkansas, even though that's how it's spelled, Arkansas. This is Central High School. I used to teach at Central Davidson High School, so there was Central High School. Everybody's like, oh, it's Central High School. Like, there wasn't more than one school named Central High School. But, so Central High School, and this is it in the back. Buildings used to be built up instead of out. So what happened was in Little Rock, Arkansas, and this is crazy. So most places when Brown versus Board of Education gets passed, it doesn't immediately change anything, because most people still go to their closest school. So Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas is an all-white school. There are 9 incoming freshmen that are black who live in that school district, all right? So they are going to sign up and go to class at Little Rock High School right after this Supreme Court decision is passed. It is absolutely insane. This is the wake-up call to the rest of the country for the first time that this type of stuff isn't going to be smooth. When those black kids, and they're called the Little Rock Nine, there's been tons, most of them are still alive today, that they showed up to school to find their school surrounded by the community throwing rocks and stuff at them. Would not let them into the school. These are 14-year-old kids, and grown adults have surrounded the school and throwing rocks at them, calling them the N-word, every horrific thing that you can possibly imagine. It's absolutely just baffling that this takes place. It's so bad that the governor of Arkansas has to call in the National Guard, has to call in the military, all right? And this is like the military showing up, and they have to aggressively enforce allowing these kids to go to school. They end up having to go pick them up in Jeeps every morning. They don't get to ride the bus. These kids have to go get picked up in Jeeps, brought to school. They're escorted into the school by men carrying machine guns, all right, like as a perimeter around them, just so that they can go into school, while the entire community stands outside and screams the most hateful, vile things you can imagine as these kids are inside trying to learn. Like, it is baffling. And the whole country's like, what? Well, like, you can be like, oh, I wish that didn't happen, you know, what? But you don't show up and throw rocks at kids, like, that are trying to go to school. And it was the first real wake-up call that the United States government had to get involved, and they're like, oh, this is crazy. And this is the stuff that's going to happen in the South. And the rest of the country, when they see this, they're like, wait, what? Because the rest of the country is kind of oblivious to how racist the South can be. And when this stuff is on TV, it blows everybody's mind. So I have a video clip of Brown versus Board of Education, and then it'll show some of this Little Rock Nine.
Through a landmark court case known as Brown versus the Board of Education, the lawyers for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, argued and won a Supreme Court decision which stated that segregation in public schools was in fact illegal. It was a 7-year-old girl from Topeka, Kansas, who helped overturn the decision that kept black and white children from attending the same schools. Because Linda Brown was black, she was forced to go to an all-black elementary school. Her father didn't understand why being black meant his daughter had to struggle to get to school every morning, while an all-white school was just a few blocks from her home. On May 17, 1954, with the help of her father and attorneys from the NAACP, including Thurgood Marshall, Linda's long walk came to an end. A unanimous Supreme Court decision declared that school segregation based on race was illegal. It impacted students in 17 states that had legally segregated schools and ultimately influenced almost every school in the U.S. Although part of the nation complied with the decision and began to integrate their schools, many were not willing to let go of their old prejudices and practices. Chaos and angry faces outside of Little Rock High School on September 4th, 1957, were evidence that the struggle for racial equality was far from over. The mob was against the court-ordered desegregation of their school. 9 black teenagers who became known as the Little Rock Nine were scheduled to attend classes alongside 2,000 white students. Amid the threats, spit, and fury of a raging mob, the children walked forward. And it was children who had to return each morning to face the persistent voice of segregation and hatred. They did it so they and eventually their children might someday be treated as equals. Weeks after school started, it still wasn't safe for the children to enter the building. It took the brave efforts of a few teachers, parents, students, and finally, intervention from the president to control the angry resistance. Eisenhower sent 1,000 paratroopers to join 10,000 members of the Arkansas National Guard who were required to provide protection. As the rest of the nation watched television reports from the security of their living rooms, 9 courageous young people confronted generations of resistance to change.
Like, that is just absolutely wild. And the fact that this was on TV, all right? I don't want to understate the civil rights movement need for TV. The reason, and we're going to start talking about some famous stories, Rosa Parks and all that. The reason that, so segregation hadn't like progressively gotten worse. It just was. And black people knew eventually they're going to have to stand up to it. But it wasn't until the advent of the television that black people could stand up to it and then show the reaction of white people, because prior to this, it would just have been taken care of, whether it's the KKK, a lynching, or something like this. When you can put it on TV and show the rest of the country that isn't racist just what is happening in the South, it is baffling. Because people don't understand that separate but equal doesn't mean separate but equal. Like it's separate, that's cool, everybody's cool with that. Like, nobody complains about it, everything's good. Because nobody could complain about it or horrible things would happen to them. Alright, so Rosa Parks, 1955. This is the year after Brown versus Board of Education. So you probably have heard of Rosa Parks. She's talked about all the time. This is kind of the start of the civil rights movement. That is what a lot of people characterize this as. So what's she famous for? She didn't give up her seat on a bus, all right, to a white person. That is true. There is a little extra that you need to know about Rosa Parks. None of this is like, I'm not going to burst any bubbles. If Rosa Parks is the hero she is to a lot of people, this does not burst any bubbles. They're not going to be like, oh, Mr. Wagstaff, don't ruin more dreams of mine. Not going to be a thing. But there is more information you need to know about this story than what it is. So the way it works, and we're in Alabama now, all right? 1955 Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. By the way, Greenbow, Alabama, which is where Forrest Gump is from, is not a real place. And that's a bummer. Anyway, so we're in Montgomery, Alabama. So here's the situation in Montgomery, Alabama. It is segregated. All right. Buses are also segregated. Public buses. Now, what kind of people ride buses? Typically, it's poorer people who can't afford cars are the ones that are going to use the buses. Now, who's the poorest part of the population? Is black people. So the busing system in Montgomery, Alabama survives because of the black people that ride. Like 80% of the people that ride the buses in Montgomery, Alabama are black. All right. So for them to be segregated is kind of ridiculous since the busing system basically survives off of black people riding the buses, but the segregation laws benefit the white people that ride the buses. Here's what the law says. All right. Now, have you ever seen the buses where they have the two sets of doors that open up? Not like where they open up like this, but I'm talking like there's actual two entrances on city buses. So this is how their buses were. Black people can sit wherever they want on the bus. That's not a problem as long as it's empty. All right. Once white people get on, all right, white people can sit in the front. All right. Black people sit in the back. That's what happens when black and white people get on the bus. Well, once the bus fills up, the middle section, and I shouldn't say black people can sit wherever they want. Black people aren't allowed to sit in the front, and I would assume white people aren't allowed to sit in the back as well. The middle section is kind of like for anybody. So if you sit in the middle section, you're fine. Unless the bus fills up and you're black sitting in the middle section and a white person needs a seat, then you're required to go to the back where there probably is no more seats and you would have to stand. So that is the laws in Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks, let's talk about her in particular. Rosa Parks is the secretary of the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama. All right. So she is already part of what the civil rights movement. Like she's already fighting to get rid of these laws and stuff like that. She rides the same bus to and from work every day. At the end of work every day, she rides the bus, and the guy who rides the bus, that drives the bus, is a racist. She sees the same guy every day. They've had beef in the past. All right. So Rosa Parks, in 1955, she gets on the bus one day at the end of her work day, and she goes and she sits down on an empty bus in the middle of the bus. Everything is fine. All right. The bus ends up filling up. Black people sit behind her. White people sit in front of her. Now, there's also a black person sitting next to her, and across the aisle, there's two other black people that are sitting there. Well, the bus is filled up. They get to a stop. A white guy gets on. Now, the white guy gets on and realizes there are no more seats. And on city buses, you can stand. He's like, cool, I'll just stand. Not a thing. So he holds on to the handle he's going to go. And the bus driver says, no. You can have that seat right there. And he points directly to Rosa Parks because he doesn't like Rosa Parks already. And he's like, she can get up. You can have her seat. And the guy's like, nah, I'm good. I'm not trying to make any waves. I'm just going 2 blocks down. I'm good. And he's like, no, she's got to get up. And he looks at Rosa Parks and says Rosa Parks, calls her by name. You get up. Now, he's just straight challenging. Rosa Parks is like, no, no. And like when she says no, and she's like bowing up to the bus driver. Now, bus drivers are kind of like the captain of the ship. What they say goes on their bus. So when she says no to them, everybody's like, oh, like they know they're not going anywhere. And so he's like, I will get the police. And she was like, well, do it. And everybody's like, oh, I don't want to go home. And so this battle is going to happen between Rosa Parks and the bus driver. So he's like, fine. So this is 1955. He can't just call the police. He has to leave the bus and go find a payphone to call the police. All right. When this happens, everybody just gets up, I'll just walk home. And so everybody gets off the bus, except for Rosa Parks, the person sitting next to her, and the 2 black people that are across the aisle. They're the only people left on the bus now. Because they're not just going to get up and leave. They're like, no, I'm going to fight this battle. So the bus driver comes back with 2 officers. And he shows back up and he's like, you, up. And she was like, no. And he's like, see, officers, I told him. And the officers are like, ma'am, will you just move? The bus is empty. Just move back to an empty seat now. And she says, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to get pushed around like this. I'm just not going to do it. And they're like, we're going to have to arrest you. And she's like, do it. And he's like, all right. And so Rosa Parks gets arrested for not giving up her seat on a bus. Now, Rosa Parks is arrested. So is the person sitting next to her and the two people on the aisle over. Rosa Parks is not the first or the last black person to get arrested for sitting in a black only or in a white only section at that time, part of the bus. Rosa Parks is clearly the most famous one to have this happen to her, and here's why. So the NAACP is basically at this time looking for a battleground. Where is the next battle we can fight where black people are treated unfairly because they're black? Rosa Parks is already part of the NAACP. So when she is arrested for a law that the NAACP already feels like is bullcrap, they're like, yes, this is going to be our next battleground. It's going to be in Montgomery, Alabama. So Rosa Parks gets arrested in 1955. So this is Rosa Parks right here. This is a real photograph of her being fingerprinted. This is what's on the front page of newspapers all over the place. So the NAACP is going to choose Montgomery, Alabama as their new battleground here for, injustice against black people. This is going to, for a couple reasons, be kind of the very beginnings of the civil rights movement. You can say it's the Brown versus Board of Education system, but it's really her getting arrested is going to change it, and here's why. And it has to do with Martin Luther King Jr. So, Rosa Parks gets arrested, and all the NAACP, people from like New York City, they come down into Alabama, all right? And they're like, all right, we're here. Let's figure this out. They realize if they can get people to boycott the buses, black people to not ride the buses will just shut down. So if they can get them to boycott the buses until buses stop having these racist policies, all right, then it will benefit black people. So what's important to understand is that Alabama ain't going to listen to a bunch of people from New York City. At the end of the day, they're still from the South. So even though they're black people from the NAACP down here telling the black people in Montgomery, Alabama what to do, they're like, nah, I ain't going to do that. Like a bunch of city slickers trying to get me fired from my job. Nah, I ain't going to do that. So the NAACP realizes really quickly they don't have any control over the people in Montgomery, Alabama. So they look around town, and there's this new preacher out named Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. he's a doctor. All right, it should be Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's not like Dr. Dre or Doc Ant or any of these other random doctors that have like fancy fake degrees. Martin Luther King Jr. has his doctorate from Boston University. He is extremely intelligent. He is a pastor. He is a Baptist preacher. He is a devout Christian. He has a small Baptist church that is extremely popular in Montgomery, Alabama. He's new to town, but people pack into his church to hear him preach. He is a fantastic speaker. The NAACP goes to Martin Luther King Jr., knowing the town loves him, and says, hey, will you organize this boycott? And he's like, so he sits down and thinks about it. Very important to understand about Martin Luther King Jr. He is a Christian first. Since we talk about him in public schools all the time, they like to kind of take that part out. Martin Luther King Jr. is a Christian first and says that from the start to the finish, all right? I always think it's odd how, like with Gandhi, nobody decides to strip him of the fact that he's Hindu. You look at these other religious figures and they don't try to take it. But Martin Luther King Jr., they're like, yeah, he's in charge of the civil rights movement. But he's a preacher. He is a Christian. He says, I want to do what Jesus would do. And so he thinks about it, and he's like, yes, I will help you with this situation. So Martin Luther King Jr. tells everybody, hey, let's boycott these buses. It's exactly what happens. A lot of people lose their jobs over this because they can't get to work. But over time, so the city of Montgomery gets so mad at Martin Luther King Jr., they arrest him. They put him in jail, all right, for inciting a riot or something, because this boycott's going to last a year, all right? When he's in jail, he's like, you know what? I think this is what I do now. I think I'm going to do Jesus's work, again, as a Christian is what he says. I'm going to do Jesus's work in the civil rights movement more than just preaching. So he writes these, it's called Letters from Birmingham Jail, in which he clarifies his views of how Jesus would react in these situations. He is eventually released from jail, and the boycott is a huge success. The bus companies change the way they do things. They stop segregation, and Martin Luther King Jr. Is viewed as this very powerful civil rights leader at the time, and the NAACP desperately wants him to like lead the NAACP. He says, nope, I'm not going to lead the NAACP. And his reason is the NAACP is not a Christian organization. It's not like anti-Christian. It's just not a religious organization. So Martin Luther King Jr. Is never part of the NAACP, which I'm sure he might have been a member, but he was not a leader of it. He creates his own thing called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. This is his own group that works with the NAACP, but it is a Christian organization. And their motto here is to carry on nonviolent crusades against the evils of second-class citizenship. He is a very famous speaker. I got one last little video clip here, and you'll be done for the day, on him giving a speech. It's fantastic. If you notice the way he speaks, there's a lot of black preachers that you hear now that speak in this cadence, very much from Martin Luther King Jr. He kind of, I don't know if he invented this cadence of the way he speaks, but it is very popular and kind of makes it mainstream.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. So just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around.
All right, if you're like, are there white people in the crowd? Yes, there were. There absolutely were white people that marched with Martin Luther King Jr. This is a picture of Martin Luther King Jr., but that is a good stopping point for today. So I will see you guys tomorrow, and we'll pick up from